underwater. But it is also so much more than that, because it's not just the things that are exciting about this museum, it's the stories that they represent. It's the things that people were able to discover because of their inventions. Someone once told me that when you go to a museum and you see a chair, for example, the chair is not what's important, it's who sat in that chair and where in the world was that chair, who built it and why. So when you think about motivations in a museum, you can think of way more interesting things. So we are now in the exhibits, as you can probably see behind me, I hope. And this is in our timeline exhibit. So at the very start of it all. And the first records of diving go back to 2700 BCE, which is about 5,000 years ago. So that is a very, very long history. But scuba diving, what we're all familiar with, is actually the teeniest, tiniest part of this story. We didn't have swimming invented until like the late 30s, early 40s, and it didn't become popular until like the 50s. And so from 2700 BCE all the way up until today, scuba is just the tiniest section of this history. But that's kind of cool in a way, because now we're all so familiar that when we look back at history and we can imagine the things that they were discovering, I think it's pretty cool to think about. So I'm going to talk to you especially about scientists. And I have to tell you, in the early history of diving, they weren't the most interested in science. To some extent, yes, but definitely they were looking to solve problems. The biggest motivations for a lot of early inventions are solving problems or making money. And we have to forgive them this because that makes it easier to live. But our first interesting records of science and diving comes from Aristotle, who was a Greek philosopher and all-around intelligent person. Back then, there was so much about the world that we didn't understand that he got to discover and uncover all kinds of things. And two diving instruments that he talked about. Behind me, you see a diving bell. And if you've ever been in a swimming pool and had a bucket and put the bucket over your head and then went underwater, you would notice that the air in the bucket presses down on the water. So you're able to go fairly deep into the water and still have air. It's a pretty limited amount of time. And as you breathe that air in, what is exhaled, after a certain amount of time, that air's not good anymore. But diving bells are one of the first ways they explored underwater. And you can see our friend's in a tunic, so we're assuming this is not modern day, right? And he would have been able to explore underwater for probably about 20 minutes max. And that's a lot of time when you've never been underwater at all. Another thing Aristotle did that I think is really cool for this group, he was extremely observant. And he especially was observant in nature. He liked to look all around at nature, things like concentric circles. And that's like perfectly wrapped circles. Like if you look in a rosebud, those are concentric circles that you're seeing. And he thought about those patterns day and night all the time, thinking about the patterns of nature. And from that, he eventually builds out the study of geometry, which we all then have to take as 8th graders. And that, I think, applied to diving is fun as well, because when you are observant and you take time to think about what you see in nature and how that applies to humanity and how that's true for other things, you have a whole new framework for seeing the world. And what's cool about a lot of the scientists that I'm talking about tonight is they all had that in common. If you're super curious and observant and you think about the things that you observe, you get to understand a lot more. And if you're lucky enough to be Aristotle or our next scientist, you also get to name all kinds of things about yourself because no one's been there yet. And so you're the first person on the moon, you get to stay the plane. So we're gonna whoosh through the next few thousand years. Here in the museum, we talk about different culture groups that free dive for a living, to fish and to find gems. We talk about the advancements of professional freediving. And this is one of my favorite areas. We call these the improbable diving machines. And I won't go too in depth about them, but they are way cool. We have, this device is from 1535. This one is from 1797. And the last one over here is from 1805. And they all work to some degree, which is wild to think about. But this one in the center actually worked the best. This is called the Klinger copper kettle diving machine. And you can see he has an axe in his hand, which tells you a little bit about his motivation. And he was designed, I say he, this device, it was designed to go into a river where a tree had fallen and to chop that tree down so that boats could pass through. So they say, mother is the necessity of invention. Necessity is the mother of invention. There it is. So a lot of things that are invented, it's to solve a problem that has come up. And we get a lot of creativity when we're put in a situation where we got to think our way out of it. But moving on, back to scientists. So the next person we're going to talk about is also an early philosopher, scientist, astronomer, all of the things, because we knew so little about the world. And his name was Edmund Halley. And if you've ever heard of Halley's Comet, that's how it got its name, because he discovered it. But in 1691, he also developed the first large diving bell. And this is a reproduction, which means it's a fake version that's designed to help you understand the concept. And 3 or 4 people could fit inside of it. And then barrels of air would be fed through hoses from the boat. And that would help resupply lots and lots of air so that divers could go down from 40 to 90 feet in order to do work and explore. And this, talking about motivations, largely was commercial. So they were trying to do essentially underwater construction work. They were building bridges, they were fixing broken boats, etc. But Edmund Halley was a naturally curious person and he was a scientist. So he also got to go in it himself. And he discovered a number of different things. Most interestingly, he discovered that blood, human blood underwater, is seen as green, not red. And he spent many years trying to figure out why. So this is an Edmund Halley invention here. And we also have his first diving helmet that he made. Not sure how well you can see that, but it's a very, very simple design. It was 1691. And we didn't have really good diving helmets until the early to mid 1800s. So quite a span before we got there. And then the most prolific part of diving history are diving helmets. It's the bulk of what we have here at the History of Diving Museum because it really best represents the history. People use diving helmets, they still use sort of diving helmets today, but way longer than we use scuba, we had these helmets. And so people would put them on with that big canvas suit like Kelly was talking about, super heavy, and they were doing hard work. And the average normal person, you and I, we wouldn't be diving in these suits. It would be commercial divers doing hard construction work, or sometimes military divers doing military work, either fixing Navy boats or doing even espionage, spy kinds of things in wartime. So the next several sections of the museum, they're talking about diving helmets like these. And I want to stop and point out one cool thing. We already talked about Converse once because that's what Art McKee wore. But if you recognize this stripe here, which might be kind of hard for you to see, Converse also made dive equipment in the 1800s. Little fun fact for you. All right, and now we move through the commercial diving exhibit. Oh, my wheels are going haywire. There we go. So this looks at the evolution of commercial diving. And we're starting. There we go. So this is a cool thing to think about, but it's a little bit misleading because represented here, you're looking at about 100 years of technology, starting from much older stuff over here, all the way up until this modern day gear here. And this is all things that were designed for commercial divers, but that doesn't mean that only commercial divers use it, because right next to me here, you're aware of what an aquanaut is. That's somebody who goes into an underwater habitat. So someone might go to Aquarius Reef Base, which is essentially a big giant hamster house that's been installed underwater permanently, and scientists and other different organizations and types of professions dive underneath, and they live in these underwater habitats so that they can better access the ocean and study things. So this is the super rare as modern aquanauts. But now we're going to go back a little bit in time, and we're going to talk about the helmets that Kelly was telling you about, the Miller Dunn. And the Miller Dunn is my all-time favorite helmet because unlike all the big, heavy, expensive suits I just showed you, they were affordable, they were easy to use, and they were available to the everyday person. And because of that, woo, the world of diving exploded. Because when people have opportunity and they have access to learn new things and put themselves in new situations, everybody in the world benefits from it. We all learn new things. So 1913 was the very, very first invention like this from the Miller Dunn Company, and it was made out of an old wooden barrel, but they quickly replaced it and with this. This is the 1916 Miller Dunn Dive and Hood Style 1. And like Kelly was telling you, it was the first helmet that was used for recreational diving. So the very first time people went out just for pleasure, just to see what was there. And that's the bulk of what diving is today. But at the time, this was revolutionary. And in a place like the Florida Keys, where I live, diving is one of our top industries. We have a ton of money that comes into our community because of diving and all of the tourism that happens around it. So it's weird to think that this is the very start of that. And then I'm going to skip over this next one because we're going to talk about it more in depth later. But this is the second style they made. And then this third one, which you already saw one example of, because this is what Art McKee dove with. And he actually, his nickname was Silver Bar. They called him Art Silver Bar McKee because he was so famous for his obsession with these silver bars. And this is the helmet that he used. He also was not the safest of divers, and he was famous for when you're diving with an open water helmet like that, you have a limit for how far you can go because you're tethered. So the tether is the long hose that comes off of your helmet to the boat where someone is physically pumping air to you. So if he was seeing treasure just out of range, he would take his helmet off underwater, swim or walk to that thing that he saw, and then come back to the helmet. He would not do well at dive camp. He would get in big, big trouble. But back to that second style. That is the style that William Beebe used. And William Beebe, we're going to talk about a little bit more at length. He was a scientist, a naturalist. He studied the natural world. And he was born in 1877, but he was most active in the scientific world starting in like the 1920s. And one thing that he was famous for, which was a relatively new idea, was studying animals in their natural habitat. So this meant at a time when medical advancements were very different from what they are now, he was climbing trees in remote jungles in the middle of nowhere. And he was looking at animals like monkeys and birds, especially. He loved birds. And he was just observing the incredible world around him. And similar, actually, to Aristotle and Edmund Halley, we knew a lot less about the world back then. So he discovered a lot of things. And also, I guess, like Aristotle and Halley, he was a natural storyteller. And I think this group, Steampunks, definitely helps you understand that when you're a good storyteller, you're able to do better science. Because what was so special about William Beebe is he got the entire country enamored, obsessed, so interested in the work that he did, because he wrote these fantastical accounts of his interesting voyages. So people would read all about the things he was doing because it was so interesting. And that is how he ended up being pretty famous for a scientist. And he got a whole underwater lab built for him. It was called the Arcturus, was the name of the ship. And we have a model of it. So it's a fake version of the boat that you can see here. And it had an underwater lab inside of it. And I'm actually going to go inside of it and talk to you a little bit more. So let me open up this porthole. So while I'm climbing inside of it, I'm going to push this up and I want you to look at all of the different scientific instruments. And these are all things that William Beebe would have used in his lab when he went to the Galapagos Islands. The Galapagos Islands are off of Ecuador in South America, and it has some of the most abundant life on the planet. So there's all kinds of different species. It is a paradise for scientists and naturalists and scuba divers, anyone who wants to see all of the things the natural world has to show. That is a great place to go. And he got to go twice. And he did something that no one had ever done before while he was on that trip. So you guys peek at his equipment and I'm gonna climb inside the Arcturus. All right, so what he did is he brought the Miller-Dunn diving helmet we just talked about, or sorry, that diving helmet we just talked about. Here it is in its case. So he brought a helmet just like this one, and he studied marine animals, so animals in the ocean, in their natural habitat for the very first time. You learn a lot more about an animal when you're in its own environment. So imagine if I was in your house and I was sitting at your kitchen table and I saw all the stuff that you had on a regular Wednesday night, I would learn a lot more about you than if I met you at a park, because I would see what kind of food you like to eat at home, what kind of shows you like to watch on TV. Like, I would learn more because I was in your world. And the same is true for animals. So I'm gonna flip my camera. Oh, no, okay. So here are some of the books and things he had in his lab. This is one of my favorite things we have here. We have all kinds of different specimens and things that he looked at. We have a megalodon tooth. And my all-time favorite specimen in here, this is a whale's ear bone. And actually inside of your ear, a teeny tiny fraction of this size, you actually have a really similar shaped bone. And the hollow section there allows for sound to echo inside of it. So if we go back to Aristotle for a second, he also studied marine organisms, but the way he studied them was he would dredge. So he would put a big net off of a boat and pull up everything to get back onto the boat and then study those things. But when you do that with a creature like a jellyfish and you bring it up 200 feet, you're really going to be looking at a pile of clear mush, and you're not learning a lot from that mush. Whereas William Beebe, wearing this helmet, is able to see that it has different colors that it shows underwater, and that sea turtles like to eat it, and that it has its own place in the natural environment. And from his first dives in this helmet, he was no longer an ornithologist, which is someone who studies birds. He was now a marine biologist, because he used the word enraptured, and that means just in love with the ocean. He could not get enough. And so he started designing new scientific procedures and new equipment in order to do more dives and learn more things about the ocean. One of those things is what actually made him most famous, and that is called the bathysphere. Ooh. Okay, so this is a model of the bathysphere, and that means it's obviously not the real thing. This is the actual model that he and his partner, Otis Barton, built in order to show investors, people who had money that were going to support them, to build this. So imagine this is about 1 foot in diameter, right? Imagine if this was 400 feet. It's not 400 feet, sorry. Imagine if this was 4 feet larger and was big enough for 2 grown men to fit inside of. The glass sections weren't actually glass. These were porthole windows made of quartz, which is a mineral. And they used this device to do something that had never been done before. They went 1,000 feet under the water to look at marine animals in their natural habitat. And the deep ocean is a pretty scary place. Once you get to a certain level, there's no more light. So all the animals at that level, that far down into the ocean, it was all dark, totally dark. And so most of the animals there had to create their own light. So he actually got to see bioluminescence, which is what this is called. He got to see it in action, and he discovered hundreds of different species. But one weird thing to think about, he was seeing things that no one had ever seen anything like this. He and his partner Otis, and he didn't have a camera because it was 1930. So they had a radio receiver, and they were describing all of the things they were seeing. And they had an artist named Elsie who was drawing all these things. And that is what was put in the newspaper, because this was news all around the world. Everyone was tuned in to listen to them down in the bathysphere. And then in all the newspapers everywhere in the world, they were reporting all of these fantastical images that he had seen. And a lot of people doubted him. They said that this wasn't real, that he was making it up, because it was so hard to fathom what the deep ocean looked like and what these creatures could do. And since then, we have some other deep sea submersibles. We have all kinds of different things we've created to explore the deep ocean. And we know a lot more about it than we did then. And I'm going to take you to another section of the museum and show you another deep, deep ocean tool that was used. But William Beebe was kind of the first. And so we here at the museum consider him the father of modern marine biology, because he was the first biologist to use diving equipment. And nowadays, if you're a marine biologist, you're diving. 100%, you are in scuba, at least sometimes. Maybe you have times where you're on the computer and you're analyzing your data, the information that you've gathered. But you have to spend some time in a wetsuit with a regulator in your mouth to understand what the ocean is like. So with that, I can move. Oh, this is a tiny boat. Squeeze out of here. All right, come with me on this adventure. All right, so you just saw a section of the museum that not a lot of people get to see. And from here, we're gonna zoom through the scuba exhibit. Although scuba is definitely a tool that modern marine biologists use, and even early marine biologists. I will mention really quick, Jacques Cousteau was a French biologist and filmmaker, and Hans and Lotte Haas were Austrian scientists and filmmakers. And they are important to the scientific world because before they started making films of the underwater world, there was not a lot of people that knew what it looked like. But if you watched a movie in 1945 that showed you what the ocean was like, that might have been your very first time seeing it. And it's hard to remember our first time knowing about the ocean today, but back before TV and YouTube and TikTok was all so prevalent, we had a lot less idea about what the rest of the world looked like. So these kinds of films were really important to getting people interested in science, interested in the ocean. There's a quote, "We protect what we love." And it's true, but if you never know about the ocean, you have no way of loving it, and you have no way of knowing that it needs a certain amount of protection. So with that, we're zooming through a few hundred years. You've got some old regulators and old scuba equipment here, some fins, and also I will show you the coolest wetsuit. One of the first wetsuits ever designed for women in the 1960s. And I would absolutely wear it today. All right, so now we're in the final stop of my tour today. We are in the abyss, the deep ocean exhibit here at the Hisford Diving Museum. And I'm gonna show you something you've probably heard of because I know how Kelly feels about Sylvia Earle. But this is a gym suit, and it was designed to go into the very deep ocean. And the first person to ever wear it to break human depth record was Sylvia Earle, who was an incredibly important scientist who helped us discover all kinds of things about the ocean. But this, in 1975, was used to go 1,025 feet underwater and break human depth records that wouldn't be broken for many years after the fact. And it was this one part of Sylvia Earle's very lengthy, large effects on the scientific world and regular people's understanding of the ocean. All right, so with that, that kind of concludes my tour. I'll walk into the light so you can see me, and I'd love to know if you guys have any questions. Kelly.
Go ahead, Emily.
Oh, why is blood green underwater?
That's a good question. You know, I told you about that, and then I didn't look up the answer as to why, but I should have. I'm guessing, actually, you know what, I can make a guess. The color red is a lot less visible underwater, and you'll actually see some divers wear masks that have a red screen in front of them, and it's called a color correcting. So it enables you to see things as they truly are, because the tint of the water can make things blue and green when they normally your eye would perceive them as red.
Carter, do you have a question?
It's a comment.
Okay.
Only 5% of the ocean has been explored.
That's true. And there are still so many mysteries that we don't know about the ocean. Another statistic that kind of blows my mind a little bit, only 17% of the ocean has any light source, has any light whatsoever. So the ocean that we know the least about, the ocean environments that we don't really know much, those are the deep oceans. And it turns out that's actually most of what the ocean is. So even if you spend a lot of time in the ocean, you really are just only at the tip of the iceberg. I saw in the comments somebody asked, did a lot of people die in early diving? Unfortunately, the answer to that is yes. So there was a lot of brave people that were heavily motivated and they wanted to learn things, but they didn't know about things like decompression illness or water pressure, how it affects the human body. So that diving bell I showed you, in France, they called it a caisson. And before we called it decompression illness, they called it caisson sickness, because people would go down in the caisson and they'd be totally fine. And then they'd come back up and they would not be right. And it was about 100 years before they started to figure out why. So luckily today, diving is a very safe activity, but it took a lot of years of figuring out how humans can safely go underwater. All right, Clive moved to Vermont. I hope it's not too cold.
And I also said that I survived 3 mild/small hurricanes.
Whoa, so you're an
Hurricane Sandy was one of them.
Hmm.
Yeah, I can't remember the others.
Hurricanes are a little more fun when you're a kid.
Yeah, and
Was that-
scary. I remember one time my house almost flooded. Like it was just a bit of water, but it was close.
That's good. All right, any other questions from you guys? Was the bathysphere powered? That is a very interesting question. The bathysphere was an interesting invention. It wasn't powered, and it was suspended from a steel cable down under all those thousands of feet. So there was the steel cable, and then there was a radio cord so that they were able to communicate. And that radio cord was actually broadcasted to I think just to the US. And then they had an elaborate system for air delivery, where they did have some air that was pumped in, but it was also recycled. So a similar technology to a rebreather today, where there's an elaborate carbon dioxide and other chemical reactions that are mixing in order to clean the air they've already breathed out. This is a little bit complicated, but the thing that I think is scary, the way that they had to make sure it stayed safe is one of them had a palm frond and was fanning the chemical mix as they were inside of the bathysphere. And they were inside it for quite some time. It took, I want to say, 2 hours just to get them to depth that they were trying to get to. And meanwhile, also William Beebe was more than 6 feet tall, and it was a 4 feet spear. And there was definitely not a bathroom. I see that question. Also, imagine how terrifying that must have been. And you're broadcasted on the radio. One of the quotes that William Beebe has from that time, it's something like, "I have now descended to a depth that no living man has descended to." It's a pretty scary thing to be experiencing in front of your whole country, or alone. All right, any more questions, steampunks?
Emily might have one.
Did the line ever break on the bell tower, on the bell?
On bells, I'm sure there was definitely instances of that, and especially because it was a technology that was used for a long time, and it was often used in more shallow waters. So I'm guessing that would have happened a fair amount, because you have to keep in mind it was used for over 100 years. So this was a technology that was really got a lot of use out of it. Great question.
Okay, thank you.
Carter, is that another question or comment, my friend?
Question. Was the underwater lab handmade, or did they use tools?
So a little bit of both. They were using tools for sure, but they're tools that were built in like the 1920s and 30s. So not nearly as effective as what we would use today. And a lot of them were hand powered. So yes, they had tools, but not nearly as efficient as what we have today. And Oscar, I saw your question too about, did he go to the Galapagos Islands before or after Darwin? And he went quite a bit after Darwin. And he was actually, Darwin was one of his heroes, and he was especially interested in Darwin's research about marine iguanas, which is a type of very large lizard. And so he wanted to continue some of that research that Darwin had done. And then he fell in love with diving instead, and I don't know how much he did on the marine lizard. Thanks.
Oh,
Emily's
Lynea, that
giving
was
us-
awesome. Really great tour.
Thank you.
So much. And yeah, so now you guys can see why I loved it so much there. It was Lynea and all of her wonderful stories. So I'll talk a little bit about what's going to happen next week. So you guys make sure to join us. We're going to be zooming in all the way across the Pacific Ocean, or at least halfway across the Pacific Ocean, to the EV Nautilus. EV stands for Explorer Vessel Nautilus. And they go out and they use ROVs or underwater robots to do a lot of exploration. And this particular trip that they're doing right now, they're actually looking at sharks. And they're looking at sharks that are in the Pacific garbage patch. So they want to see what's affecting the sharks. Does the garbage affect them? So two different things. A lot of you guys like sharks, so that'll be interesting. And then garbage. What is it affecting them? How is it affecting them? What can we find out about that? So that's going to be a tremendous Zoom event. Make sure invite your friends. Anybody can come to this. So it does, young, old, it doesn't matter. We're all here. We're going to have a good time. And they're fantastic. So then the following week, we're going to be, I don't know if we'll be joining Lynea or she'll be joining us, but we're going to be talking about mangroves. And the reason we're going to be talking about mangroves is because we're going to be participating as a group in an art project. And maybe Lynea, you can tell us a little bit about the art project or what you guys do with the art before we go.
Absolutely. But can I tell a tiny story first?
Absolutely.
So the EV Nautilus is really cool, and you guys are going to have so much fun. But the name Nautilus is really interesting. You see a lot of vessels today that are called that. But the reason they're called that is because in 1867, a novelist, Jules Verne, wrote a story called 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. And and his ship from that story was called the Nautilus. And we have a model of it here in the museum. It's kind of dark. It's sort of hard to see on Zoom. But what's cool about Jules Verne, he was observant, just like we're talking about tonight. He loved looking at technology and imagining all of the potential for it. So he created the most coolest, interesting, fascinating, amazing submarine in his story called the Nautilus. And it was so advanced that he got in trouble because the French Navy thought he had stolen their plans and made them better. So that's why a lot of things are called the Nautilus, because of an author in the 1860s. You have a question, bud? Or a comment?
I have a book about the sperm whale versus the octopus, and when we were looking at a page, the octopus leg was holding 20,000 weeks under the sea.
Okay. I don't know if you can see behind my head here, but we have a big squid leg that comes into the exhibit. That's a big part of the story. It's pretty scary. Okay, but on to mangroves. So we have an art exhibit that's going to start next year called Edge of the Sea. And it's about all of the parts of the world where land meets sea, those coastal areas like mangrove habitats. And so we're going to be looking at the unique ways that humans live close to the ocean and all of the unique ocean animals and plants and life that happens close to like land, where land meets sea. So the exhibit is called Edge of the Sea, and we have an opportunity for all kinds of students all over the country to make art that's connected to Edge of the Sea. So you might be making mangrove tunnels. You might be making birds that live in that habitat. You get a lot of freedom of idea of what you want to do. But then it's an art show of both adults and students, and people will get to see all your masterworks and learn more about mangroves and other coastal habitats. Sound cool? All right.
Awesome. Thank you so very much, Lynea. That was really great.
Happy to do it.
Yeah. Anybody else with any other questions? We got 1 minute.
1 minute.
1 minute.
Mr. Larry has chimed in.
Yes.
Hi, Larry.
Hi.
Ocean clean.
I figured, with the sharks and I know it's not a shark, but I figured that was a little appropriate for next week. So I just wanted to say hi to everybody.
Oh, that's cool.
And yeah, I got to listen to about half. Apologize for being late. My daughter was inducted into the National Honor Society, so we're kind of excited about that.
So she got her looks and her brain. No, I'm sorry.
And her abilities, yeah, which is good. But no, just wanted to thank everybody. If you've been checking out the Curious Minds website, it's going to look a little bit different tomorrow. We are launching our new website tomorrow, and we are excited about that. Some new features and a new look. So check it out, and there'll be some opportunities for everybody. But it's already 8 o'clock, and I don't want to keep anybody too late. So I will turn this back over to David and Kelly.
All right.
That's all, folks. We'll see you guys next week. Thank you all for coming. Thanks again, Lynea and Kelly. Thank you for braving this storm and getting back online. We appreciate that.
Yeah.
Good to see all y'all. Hope to see everybody next week. Bring friends. Tell people. We want more. We want more faces.
Bye.
Yes.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
We'll send out an email too. So
Bye.
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 Say goodbye, cat.
How are you doing? Kelly?
Oh, how am I doing? Oh, great. Yeah, just a little bit of cleanup to do and it's all good.
Okay.
Yeah.
How do the rest of the lower keys, upper keys do?
So there's a lot, mostly it's just water on the roads right now, and there are a lot of trees down.
Yeah.
And so a lot of vegetation cleanup that's got to happen. But otherwise, I think they said 100 homes flooded. The power company was amazing. I think, you know, a few people were without power for a couple of hours overnight, but that's it.
That's
Everybody-
awesome.
They got power back by, 9 o'clock this morning or whatever. So
Yeah, they're getting pounded right now up there in the
they are.
north.
Yeah.
They are. And it's
Yeah.
only moving 8.5 miles an hour. So it's
Yeah,
not
that's-
moving fast at all.
Erica's been texting. She was like, yeah, this is
Dumping a lot of water.
brutal. So,
Dumping a
well,
lot
we
of
got to
water.
figure out a way to get more kids to these because we have had 2 back-to-back phenomenal weekends.
Yeah.
So,
So do you keep reaching out to the contacts that y'all made up in at the boat, the tall ship thing?
mhm.